Greetings from Chicago. Thanks for checking out this virtual reading. Instead of coming to see me at a bookstore or a library, you get to join me at home. I'm in my study, and I'm grateful for these platforms that allow writers and readers to continue to connect. So welcome. Today I'm going to read an excerpt from my newest novel, Brilliant Rising, to be published by She Writes Press in the fall of 2021. The story of Jules and David Heron begins in April 2008. If you think back 12 years, you'll remember this period as the time when most Americans began to see the effects of the bursting lending bubble and the start of the country's economic downturn. When Jules Heron wakes on this April morning in 2008 to begin her workday at the bakery she owns with her husband David, a few minor annoyances, a pulled muscle in her arm, an argument with her husband over cutting corners in the bakery, and worry about their stalled bakery expansion plan derail her progress out the front door. The day goes downhill when she arrives at work. Talk with her assistant revolves around the shaky economy, a frightening trend that she's paid no attention to in her busy days. Greetings from Chicago. Thanks for checking out this virtual reading. Instead of coming to see me at a bookstore or library, you get to join me at home in my study. And I'm grateful for these platforms that allow writers and readers to continue to connect. So welcome. Today I'm going to read an excerpt from my newest novel, Brilliant Rising, to be published by She Writes Press and due out in the fall of 2021. The story of Jules and David Heron begins in April 2008. If you think back 12 years, you'll remember this period as the time when most Americans began to see the effect of the bursting lending bubble and the start of the country's economic downturn. When Jules wakes on this April morning in 2008 to begin her workday at the bakery she owns with her husband, a few minor annoyances derail her progress out the front door. The day goes downhill when she arrives at work. Talk with her assistant baker revolves around the shaky economy, a frightening trend that she has paid no attention to in busy days. Other bakery staff unwittingly reveal that David has been keeping from her details that reveal their foot traffic has fallen sharply. This news forces Jules to suspect that all is not as it seems with the stalled expansion project or in her marriage. When Jules arrived at the bakery, she flipped the switches to turn on the lights, the ovens, and the vents. Within seconds, the bakery kitchen was bright and noisy. As the convection ovens heated up, Jules put on a small pot of strong coffee for the jolt of caffeine she needed to get her through the first few hours of baking. While she could probably do the job in her sleep, she didn't want to. Coffee was essential. She filled a basket filter with several scoops of French roast, flipped yet another switch to start the brew, and waited by the machine for the first few drips of coffee to hit the pot. As soon as there was enough for serving, she filled a tall paper cup and brought it, along with a clean apron, to her workbench. Most days she would savor the first few minutes at work alone as she brewed and sipped her cup of coffee. With her back resting against the broad oak work table set in the middle of the kitchen, she would let the coffee do its work as she looked out onto the dark and empty main street. This morning, though, she had no time to linger. She heard David complain, "I'll be doing crowd control," and she sighed. He was right. He had been right about a few things this morning, but not everything. The comparison he made to her mother-in-law still stung. She was nothing like Miriam with her skill for focusing on failure. The woman was negative, a person with impossibly high standards who poked and prodded at other people's shortcomings. At Jules's most generous, she described her mother-in-law as chronically disappointed. She sipped more coffee and recalled the night she and David announced he was quitting his job and they were buying a building to open a bakery downtown. The same night she vowed she would see her mother-in-law as little as possible in the months leading up to the opening. David had warned her the evening might get ugly. He hadn't wanted to tell his parents at all. "So how does that work?" she asked him. "We open a business and we swear everyone we know to secrecy?" "Something like that, yes." She smiled at him then and suggested they invite his parents to dinner to make the announcement on comfortable turf. "We eat, we tell them, they leave." David relented. The invitation was issued and accepted. Between the main course and dessert, he dropped the news and was met with his mother's stunned stare. During the awkward lull, David offered coffee and rose to make it. Jules remembered the looks passing between mother and son, how she waved him back into his seat, knowing he would want the time alone with his parents to get them on board with the news. "Let me," she said, and disappeared into the kitchen to start the drip machine. As soon as she left, their voices rose. "Why in the world would you do this? Turn your back on all your education for something so reckless?" "Nothing's reckless. We wrote a business plan and the bank approved it. For a bakery? For a bakery, it's what we want to do." "I have a hard time believing you want to do this. Someone like Julia, who couldn't even finish college, yes, but not you." "Geez, Mom, that's..." Later, Jules told him this, that alone in the kitchen, she tried to drown out the rest of the argument by running cold water full blast for the pot of coffee. It would have taken a tsunami, though, to drown her out, she told him. He had reached for her then, told her they would keep their distance from his parents, that they would create their own world where no one and nothing negative could interfere. In the quiet of the bakery, his sharp words of earlier came back to her. "Stop it," she told herself, and she shook her head to clear it. They were both overwrought, and she was being a drama queen. The only thing to do was throw herself into work. She set down her coffee cup, tied the crisp apron at her waist, and walked over to the refrigerators to gather the ingredients she needed to make the first round of pastries. Jules checked the production list David left taped to the fridge door and then lifted a wrapped package of butter-rich dough from the shelf where it had been chilling overnight. She looked it over for problems or irregularities, but there were none. Numerous alternating layers of butter and yeast dough, a perfect trifold, nice squared off edges, and a good height. Sandy had prepped it well yesterday afternoon. David had been reminding them lately to eliminate as much waste as possible, and Sandy's meticulous prep work mattered. The Danish and croissant dough couldn't be rolled more than once, and this rectangle would feed into the rollers of the rondo and come out the other end in mostly a neat sheet, meaning nothing much needed to be trimmed and tossed. If this had been sugar cookie dough, though, given David's latest protocol change, she would have had to gather up the scraps and re-roll them at least twice. The cookie that gets cut from a re-roll is a tougher cookie, she had argued last week when they discussed changing the practice. "Crisper," David answered, "not tougher, and still acceptable." He added, pointing out that the decorated sugar cookies often went to children. "A 5-year-old won't be able to tell if the sugar cookie is crisper than you'd like it to be. They're into the frosting and biting the ears off the Easter bunnies. Besides, I don't feel right tossing ingredients in this day and age." Making less than perfect baked goods bothered Jules, even for undiscriminating children. But David was right. Throwing away good food was a bad habit, especially now when food costs were so high. From her vendors, from the invoices she occasionally had to sign when accepting deliveries, she knew flour prices had risen sharply. Prices of all her ingredients had, really. At least he wasn't asking her to scoop less muffin batter into the tins, not yet anyway, although it was probably only a matter of time before she had that conversation with him. Jules frowned as she anticipated arguments about portion control. Customers loved her oversized muffins. The sheer height of their plump domes, glistening with crystals of sanding sugar, prompted people to head home with more treats than they had intended to buy. She was convinced of it. She began feeding the Danish dough into the rondo. Thunk, thunk, the gears engaged as she operated the handle and sent the dough rolling down the belt and then back. "Think of my muffins as a lost leader," she would tell David if they had another cost control conversation. "Economizing can't be our only goal." Unless he dismissed that conversation too as another not worth having, and made the decision without consulting her. Jules frowned but kept dialing down the settings on the rolling machine and sending the dough up and down the belt until the sheet had reached her desired thickness. Up and down, up and down. When the dough reached the right thickness, her hands went to work, running the rolling cutter down the length and cutting the sheets into long ribbons, twisting each one into a corkscrew spiral, coiling each long twist like a snail's shell, tucking in the ends before placing the sweet rolls, ready for their fruit fillings on the waiting baking trays. She barely needed to think about the movements anymore. Before she knew it, her first few trays were full and ready for the proofing box. She racked them for their rise and turned to the muffins, scooping into buckets of batter lifted from the fridge, filling tin after tin. When done, Jules reached for a tray of blueberry muffins and opened the oven door with her free hand. As she slid the pan into the oven, she was hit with a blast of cold air, pushing its way in through the front door. Jules turned, Sandy had arrived for her shift on a gust of wind. Quick, Sandy, close the door, it's freezing. Sorry, the storm's blowing in. Temperature dropped at least 15 degrees on my drive over, but the rain has stopped for now. Sandy pulled the door shut behind her and turned the lock. Closing created a vacuum, and the tarp they called Swayze rustled back and forth a little before settling back into place. Jules noticed that the once clear plastic sheet was cloudy and marked all over with white wrinkles. Its bottom edge was tattered despite the fact no one had pushed it aside or crossed through it in days. Sorry I'm late, Sandy said as she detoured to the coffee pot. I'm glad there's coffee. You're a peach, boss. No problem. I got a late start too, just now catching up. She returned to her bench for another muffin tin. Sandy reached for an extra large paper cup and held it up to Jules. Jules shook her head. Her coffee had gone cold, but she would wait until she had more baking underway before accepting a refill. Sandy poured the last of the coffee for herself, took a sip, and groaned with pleasure. Coffee, you are my first true love. As she shrugged out of her coat, she looked over at the tarp. Swayze looks a little worse for wear. She tipped her chin in its direction. When did that happen? What does it say about me that I hardly notice it anymore? Same. I actively avoid noticing it, Jules said. What's going on with the construction? Sandy asked, looking over the rim of her cup. You know yet? Jules frowned. Sandy was uncharacteristically chatty. Most days they maintained a relationship that both appreciated, companionable and cooperative, but separate. The two barely said more than good morning until much of the baking was done and the shop priming to open. Scrambling today, Jules wanted to stay focused on work. They both needed to. Without looking up from her bench, she said, David told me the builder had to start another job or lose the bid, but he hopes to be back once he frees up guys from that other job. Next week, maybe. Maybe? So no guaranteed return date? Although annoyed with Sandy for pressing for answers, Jules paused and tried to recall David's exact words. I don't want you to worry about it too, okay? It's not ideal, but I talk to him often enough that he remembers we're waiting. They'll be back in a week or so, I predict. Predict, that was the word he used. She remembered now. David's guess, not the builder's guarantee. At the time, she had let his vagueness slide and had gone right back to her job of putting food in the display cases. Next week or the week after, she said to Sandy, with more conviction than she felt, and that she set the timer, subtracting a minute to make up for the time she'd wasted talking. That's good, Sandy said. My boyfriend says this sometimes happens when someone commissions a job but can't pay their bills. I told him he was off base. Sandy made a move to start her work, taking a big sip of coffee. Yes, he's off base. Jules spoke more sharply than she intended, but she felt irked that a guy she barely knew would weigh in at all, especially with his suggestion that money was somehow at the root of the problems. Their bank loan had been secured months ago with the same bank they'd been doing business with for years. I shouldn't have said anything. He's anxious is all. He's been trying to sell his condo and his agent's telling him it's worth less than his mortgage. At this point, he'd be better off holding on until the market improves. But he really wants to move closer to his work. It's getting to him, I think. Jules nodded. It's fine. Everyone's anxious about something lately. They're calling this housing market a bubble, like everything was inflated and now it's about to burst. For once, I'm kind of glad I lost out on that condo I made an offer on last year. Housing bubbles. This really was all news to Jules. Talk about a bubble. She'd been in her own, working and sleeping, driving her daughter here and there, for months seeing no one except the people who passed through these doors. If it helps, I remember the same thing happening about 20 years ago, and the banks adjusted their lending. At least that's what our loan officer said at the time. I don't really follow this much, but I'm sure things will straighten out again. And maybe you can look for another condo. It's nice to own. Hey, my muffins are all in and I'm going to clean up, she said, putting an end to the talk about Sandy's boyfriend's anxieties and the stalled renovation in the cafe space. Jules walked over to the sink and mixed up a weak bleach and water solution. She took this back to her bench and head down began scrubbing at the sticky workshop with a clean towel. As much as she wanted to put these thoughts out of her mind, something about the boyfriend's observations nagged at her. And for the first time, Jules wondered about Nancy from the arts and crafts shop next door, how quickly she had closed her doors and moved out. One day she was complaining that no one was shopping for art project kits anymore. Everything they needed they could find online, delivered right to their doorsteps. The next day, there was brown paper on the windows. At the time, Jules gave Nancy's comment little thought. David's excitement about the extra space finally opening up eclipsed everything. She smiled, thinking about how infectious his enthusiasm had been. Just as quickly, though, an image of David popped into her head. David on the sidewalk outside the bakery, arms outstretched, palms up, exchanging words with the building project boss, who only kept shaking his head. The timer rang and interrupted Jules's wandering thoughts. Startled, she looked down at the rag in her hands and the bench. 11 minutes had passed. It was time to rotate the muffin tins, and she had been scrubbing the same square foot of the table surface over and over. She felt her face flush with embarrassment and looked up to make sure Sandy hadn't noticed her distraction. Jules set down the cloth and wiped her hands on her apron. The top shelf of the oven was a stretch for Jules without the step stool, but she didn't want to waste any more time crossing the kitchen to retrieve it. She grabbed a set of pot holders and then stood on her toes to reach for the uppermost tin, like she had done a million times before. But this time, as she did, both forearms hit the hot oven rack. Jules had been burned so many times over the past 20 years, her hands bore many scars, but she never grew accustomed to the first moments of searing pain. She cursed and rotated the muffin tin the rest of the way around, slid it onto the shelf, and shut the door. She had managed to save the half-baked muffins from hitting the floor, but now the skin on her forearms stung, red stripes emerging, one on each arm, almost identical twins, a few inches up from her wrists. When she lifted her wrists up closer to her face, she could feel the heat radiating off her skin. Sandy came up behind her. "You've got the first aid kit." "I'm fine. Maybe just some cold water." "You're not fine." She took one of Jules's hands in her own and looked closely at the puckering skin. "These are already starting to blister. Let's get some ointment and bandages on there." Jules nodded. "Actually, I could use some ice first. My skin feels so hot." "Ice? Sure," Sandy said. "Go sit in the bathroom. I'll meet you there." She handed the red metal box to Jules and hustled over to the freezer. Jules walked with the kit to the back of the kitchen, into the staff bathroom. She hit the light switch and was greeted by her reflection in the mirror. The fluorescent bulb made her skin look sallow. She set the first aid kit down on the sink vanity and looked away. "That was lame of me," Jules said when Sandy walked through the door. "Lame and stupid." "Sit down," Sandy told her. Jules obeyed and took a seat on the toilet lid. Sandy had filled 2 bread bags with ice cubes, and she applied these to the burns once Jules settled with her arms resting on her thighs. "It happens, boss." "It shouldn't happen when we're already running behind schedule." "That's when it always happens," Sandy smiled. "Murphy's Law. But still." So we're behind, so what? It's not the end of the world." Jules smiled at Sandy's steadiness. She had been right. Sandy would make a fine leader. "No, it's not the end of the world," she agreed. Things could be worse, she thought to herself, as Sandy made quick work of the bandaging. Things could always be worse. Thanks for joining me today.